We're going to look some more at our waste management options. So we talked about recycling and reducing and reusing and refusing, and now we look at that after, so more at the end of the pipe, about what do we do with the stuff that we can't do anything with one of our R's in there. So one of the things that we can do is incineration, and there's a video about a waste to energy plant on Canvas after this video, where you can see what a waste to energy incinerator looks like. But basically, it's using the trash to generate the energy to boil the water to make the steam. When we talked about generating electricity, we talked about it's all about what makes the steam to turn the turbines, or what turns the turbines. And in this case, excuse me, instead of burning oil or coal or natural gas, they're burning trash. So there are some of these around the world. Not a ton of them, but there are some. So here's what it looks like, and the videos actually shows it a lot better. But they bring all the trash in, they sort out all the recyclables and things like that, and then they put the trash into a hopper, which goes down into the place where it burns. The furnace is where it burns it up. It boils the water, which makes the steam, turns the turbine, generates the electricity. What they have then at the end are some ash that they have to deal with. Some of it can be can go to the conventional landfill, and then some of it which comes out of the air. So what happens is that as it burns, it makes smoke, and then they have precipitators, which we've talked about before, where the electrostatic one is where it basically sends electricity through the air and it zaps the solid particles out of the air, and that's what's over here, and that's what has to go to the hazardous materials landfill. But the rest of it, that's just the straight ash that came out of the burning process, can go to the conventional landfill. So there are some benefits to the incineration. Because we're generating electricity from it, we don't need to have it in the landfill. There's no possibility of the water table getting contaminated from this, and if they're using the electrostatic precipitators and they're making sure that nothing's coming out of the smokestack at the end, and so it reduces the amount of pollution that's there. Unfortunately, once again, it does kind of encourage that would make more trash because we can just burn it up anyhow. And then there's also that question of where to place it, because nobody really wants to live next to a waste-to-energy incinerator. And then if they're not recycling enough of the stuff out of there, it can compete financially with some of our recycling efforts as well. One of the primary ways that we deal with solid waste is through landfills. So remember, MSW is municipal solid waste, and usually it's buried in landfills. And so the landfills, there was a video also about what a landfill looks like and how it has the different layers and things like that are supposed to keep the liquids out of the aquifer and to actually pump some of those liquids out, and so they end up going to water treatment plants and things like that. So open dumps we don't generally see here in the United States. They're not allowed by law because that's where you just on the land, just dump it. You've seen some pictures of that already. The sanitary landfill is what we utilize here in the United States. So, and here's a diagram of what it looks like. And so the waste is placed in here, and you'll see in the video when they talk about it that they go and they plow around and they kind of flatten it all down, and they evenly layer it out and everything. And down below, so it's got these different layers of protection. So it has these impermeable layers essentially, or liners, concrete liners and plastic liners and things like that are supposed to keep all of the stuff out of the water table. And then just like you would have in a septic system, you have a leach field or leach pipe. So as the material decomposes, it's going to release liquids. They're going to go down into this leach pipe system, and then they get pumped out and go into a water treatment. They do have monitoring stations around it. They're looking for methane, and they're looking at the groundwater to make sure that none of this is getting down into the water table. So they're also looking for methane leaks that are coming out here, but you'll also have you'll see, like, especially at our landfills here, you'll see pipes, and sometimes the tops of the pipes are on fire. And the reason for that is because methane is a byproduct as the waste decomposes. It builds up methane, and there has to be a way for that to be piped out. Otherwise, the landfill will basically explode over time It takes a while, but it would happen. And so some places, what you see in this picture up here is where they actually have another kind of waste-to-energy plant where they're using the methane that comes from the trash as it's decomposing, and they pump it into there, and then they're actually able to use it for energy. If you're interested in that kind of a thing, there's a really cool Mythbusters about where they used methane from cow manure from off of a farm to actually generate all the electricity for the farm, which was kind of cool. But so a sanitary landfill is a big is kind of a big endeavor to build, and there's lots of monitoring that goes on with it to make sure that it's not causing damage to the environment. So the smell, I know if you've ever been to a sanitary landfill, it's not that it doesn't stink, because it's trash, right, that's decomposing, but it's not like the open dumps. There's much lower odor because they do cover it daily on there. And while it does have low operating costs, there's, if it's monitored and built correctly, we have low probability of pollutants getting out into the environment from here. But once again, we only have so much space where we're willing to bury trash, and so, where people are willing to live next to the place where we bury trash. And so, there will come a time where we'll have used all those areas. And if you've ever driven by a landfill, there's the one that's on Union Hills there in between 7th Street and 7th Avenue. That's on the north side of the street, and by the cemetery, and that's a huge landfill, and there's no municipal solid waste in there. That's all industrial solid waste. It's things like concrete and rebar and stuff like that. It didn't take municipal trash, but there's only so many places that we can do that. So on the downside is really the traffic and the dust. So as you're burying all this stuff up, it does kick up dust. Once again, it is going to release some greenhouse gases, and the rest of that is like if it's not done properly. So the slowing the decomposition of waste, the reason that that's a true statement is because most of our waste require most of our bacteria require oxygen in order to function. And so if we are layering the trash and we're like sealing it down essentially, so the odor's not getting out, it also means that bacteria is not getting in there to actually do its job. And so there was this professor at ASU that did a research study, and they were looking at trash and landfills and things like that, and they actually found newspapers that were like 50 years old that they could still read. They found food waste like hot dogs and things like that you could still tell what they were, because they had been sealed in so well that the decomposition wasn't occurring. So really it's kind of like storing our trash rather than have it break down and kind of go away. They also can't build on top of it unless it's something like a golf course. So there's the golf course that's off of the Carefree Highway where there was landfill, and they can build things like that on it, but you can't build buildings because of settling, because it's not firm land anymore. So we're going to talk a little bit about hazardous waste. One of the primary ones is commercial nuclear waste, and you'll see a video for this as well in Canvas, because when we start to create these wastes, we have to have a place to put them. So we're going to talk about some different storage ways. So once again, hazardous is anything that really can cause harm to us. We look at solids or liquids when we're talking about hazardous wastes. We have organic compounds, and we have our toxic heavy metals, as far as our groups are concerned of types of hazardous wastes. So when you look at like around your house, and you already listed for me some things that you thought might be hazardous when we talked about water. And some of these things are ones that you came up with. Some of them were in the gizmo when we talked about water pollution. And a lot of these are still, they're the hazardous materials because they're going to cause damage or harm to either people or the environment. A lot of these kinds of things are things that you should not be putting down the sink. So for example, if you have leftover paint, like you guys paint your walls or something like that, with these, if it's liquid, it's considered a hazardous material, and you would have to take it to the hazardous materials pickup. The city of Phoenix has them quarterly, and they're usually at a park or something like that. And if you live in the city, usually it comes with your water bill that tells you like where you can actually drop stuff off at. But with latex paint only, not the oil-based paint, but the latex paint, if you don't use it all and you take the lid off of it and you let it dry, then you can put it into the trash. But for a lot of these things, you're not supposed to put them in the trash. You're not supposed to put them down the sink or anything like that. So there's two laws that you're going to need to know that regulate the disposal of hazardous waste, and both of these came out of an incident that happened in New York that was called the Love Canal. And we'll go through, this was one of your case studies that you read as well, and we'll talk a little bit about what happened there. But the two acts are, one of them is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. Cradle to the grave means from the time that it's created to the time that it's put into storage where it can't harm anything anymore. It requires the company that made it to keep track of that waste. So just because I'm the company that fabricates it doesn't mean that once I sell it, that it becomes no longer my responsibility. They have to track through that company that they sell it to, and then where does it go from there. The other one is abbreviated as CERCLA. It's the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. And this is one that we usually call Superfund. And what this did was it set up a fund of money to help clean up large contaminated sites, especially in areas where the company that was responsible for the waste is no longer in existence. And that was the case of what happened in Love Canal. So this one was kind of like well, I didn't do it, so it's not my responsibility. So this is where Superfund comes into play to help take care of those areas. We do have about 11 Superfund sites here in the Phoenix area. So basically, the polluters are the ones that are going to be paying for the hazardous waste. So if they're a company that is creating the pollution, then they're going to pay a tax, essentially, to help with those cleanup costs. And then the rest of it comes from public taxes. So since 2006, there's been some added to this national priorities list, but we're only looking at the very worst sites. It's not everything that could possibly be cleaned up or every place where there's hazardous materials. And they're not all actively being cleaned up at the same time. So Superfund made it so that we could actually clean things up, like the Love Canal. So that way they're not allowed to just dump in areas, and we'll talk a little bit more about the Love Canal in a few minutes. And they had to, and it really did make them reduce what they were producing, because if they have to keep track of it through the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, then they're not going to want to spend that time and money. So they're looking for better solutions for things that they can use that aren't as toxic. So we lost some of the funding, which is a challenge, and now the taxpayers are paying for it, which is also a challenge. So when we look at how do we actually deal with hazardous waste, we always start with our R's, right? And our first R is to refuse. So we always want to make less. So that we don't want to make as much of the contaminant, we don't want to make as much of the chemicals, so that we don't have to deal with as much of it later on. And then whatever we can that is already made, like this first square is the only one that's front of the pipe. It's the only one that we're trying to not put as much into the system. Once it's there, then we try to recycle or reuse if we can. If you think about like motor oil and things like that, those can be recycled. They don't just get thrown away. And then this is where we diverge a little bit from where we talked about the rest of waste when we were trying to deal with it. In this one, now we try to convert it to something that's less hazardous. And we can do that in a number of different ways. And all these different methods that are on here kind of depend on what the chemical is. All of these boxes will not apply to every single chemical. So we look at how can we actually make something, can we convert it into a less hazardous substance, either by, heating it up or something like that. And then we have to, what's left that we can't turn into that less harmful substance, we have to put into perpetual storage. And so then we have to figure out how are we going to store this so that it doesn't get into the water table and it doesn't cause damage. So when we talk about some of that conversion to the less hazardous substances, we have physical means and we have chemical means. So some of the physical means are we can actually like soak up some of that harmful stuff using charcoal, which is actually a really good absorbent. Or we can use another chemical or induce a chemical reaction to make it something less harmful. Usually heating it up is what happens with the chemical reactions. We also have some biological methods where we're either using bacteria or enzymes or we're using plants in order to remediate. So bioremediation is where we use life, where it either eats it up, and we use this in water treatment, right? Or we use phytoremediation, where they actually plant plants in the area, which kind of looks like this. So there's areas where they can actually, like, plants will either be fast growing, they can tolerate the chemical, and then they'll take the chemical out, they'll take the plant out after it's absorbed all around its root system, and then they'll dispose of it either through incineration or something like that. So there are some benefits and some downsides, as always, to these things, but for the most part, phytoremediation has very little disadvantages, except for the fact that it's slow. But the rest of it is really something that the rest of them can really be controlled, and so it's a good way to remediate some of the areas where we have our toxic spills.